On the 8th of July, 2025, a 67-year-old man from Alvarado, Texas, started down the South Kaibab Trail on the south rim of the Grand Canyon. He was heading for the Colorado River and an overnight stay at Phantom Ranch, a booking so difficult to get that people plan years ahead for it. He never reached it. Somewhere around the 3-mile mark, at a place called Skeleton Point, he made the decision the National Park Service tells every summer hiker to make. He turned around. He gave up the river, gave up the night at the bottom, and started climbing back toward the rim. At about 11:50 that morning, someone found him unresponsive on the trail below Cedar Ridge. Bystanders started CPR. Park Service medical personnel came down on foot. Resuscitation failed. He died there, roughly a mile and a half from where he had started. The Park Service issued a statement afterward. It was not an alarm. It was a reminder about summer temperatures, about pre-existing conditions, about the peak heat hours between 10 in the morning and 4 in the afternoon. The same reminder they publish every year in more or less the same words. That is the part that should stop you. Not that a man died on a trail. That the people who run this place absorbed it as ordinary. This channel breaks down why specific places keep killing people, using the actual record instead of the stories that get told about it. If that's what you're here for, subscribe. By the end of this, you'll understand what actually kills people on the South Kaibab Trail, and why it is almost never the thing they were afraid of. Start with the size of the thing, because the numbers only become disturbing once you see them together. Between 2007 and 2024, the National Park Service recorded 198 deaths inside Grand Canyon National Park. Over that same stretch, more than 77.9 million people visited. Set those two numbers side by side and the risk looks like nothing. It is nothing individually. The park's own 10-year average sits at 17 deaths a year, though some reporting citing park officials puts the figure lower, somewhere between 10 and 15. Either way, against 4.5 million annual visitors, your personal odds of dying here are close to irrelevant. In 2025, 4,430,653 people came through the gates. That made it the fourth most visited national park in the country. The year before, it was nearly 4.9 million. Now do the multiplication that actually matters. A vanishingly rare event applied to millions of people stops being rare. It becomes a schedule. That is the first thing to understand about the Grand Canyon. It does not have accidents. It has an output. Somewhere between 10 and 17 times a year on average, the canyon produces a body, and the machinery around it, the dispatch center, the helicopter, the Coconino County Medical Examiner, turns over and processes it. And the next morning, 4 million more people arrive with no idea any of it happened. Underneath the deaths sits a much larger layer almost nobody sees. The park runs roughly 300 to 310 search and rescue operations a year. In 2005, it reported 307, the most of any unit in the entire national park system. In 2017, its 290 operations accounted for 10% of every search and rescue conducted across the whole system that year. In 2014, 324 operations cost the park just over $500,000. And on top of that sit the hiker assists, several hundred more each year, people who did not need a helicopter but did need a ranger to get them out. So the death count is the visible tip, the rescue count is the part below the water, and a disproportionate share of both comes off a small handful of trails. One of them runs 6.5 miles down a ridgeline from a trailhead you are not allowed to drive to. There is a reason for that, and it is not the reason you'd guess. Look at the South Kaibab Trail on a map, and it reads as the sensible choice. It is the short one, 6.5 miles from rim to river against Bright Angel's longer route. It is maintained. It is wide enough for mule trains. It is patrolled. It starts at 7,260 feet with a shuttle stop, a restroom, and a water spigot. Everything about the approach says managed, signed, handled. Then walk down it and the illusion holds even better, because South Kaibab is genuinely one of the most beautiful walks in North America. It runs along the spine of a ridge rather than down a side canyon, so the view is enormous in both directions the entire way. The first overlook, about a mile down, is named for the sound people make when they see it. Here's what almost nobody accounts for. Everything that makes this trail spectacular is the same thing that makes it lethal, and both facts have the same cause: the ridgeline. A ridge gives you the view because there is nothing between you and the canyon. It also means there is no shade. The Park Service's own trail guide describes very little shade for the length of the route, and what exists depends entirely on the time of day and the angle of the canyon walls. There is no side stream. There is no cottonwood. There is no wall to press yourself against at 2 in the afternoon. And there is no water. Not at Cedar Ridge, 1.5 miles down. Not at Skeleton Point at 3 miles. Not anywhere on the trail at all. Water exists at the trailhead, and then it exists again at the bottom, at Phantom Ranch, and between those 2 points the trail supplies nothing. That is the shape of this place, and it is the idea this whole video runs on. The South Kaibab does not kill you by adding a danger. It kills you by removing your margin. It is a trail made of subtractions, and every one of those subtractions is invisible on the way down. You don't need water when you're descending in cool morning air. You don't need shade at 7 a.m. You don't need a bailout point when you feel completely fine. All of them become mandatory in the same hour. And by then you are already below them. Ask most people what kills visitors on a trail like this, and the answer is instant. The edge. It is a reasonable answer. This is a knife-edge ridgeline with drops measured in hundreds of feet, sometimes within a step or two of the tread. In July of 2016, a 35-year-old woman photographing sunrise at Ooh-Ah Point, 1 mile from the trailhead, accidentally stepped off the edge and fell approximately 400 feet. Park-wide, falls are the second most common cause of death in the Grand Canyon. The researcher who has spent decades cataloging canyon fatalities recorded 125 fatal falls. 64 from the rims, 61 from inside the canyon. So the fear is not irrational, it is just aimed at the wrong thing. Here's what the data actually says. Every South Kaibab fatality the Park Service reported in 2024, 2025, and 2026 was heat or exertion driven. Not one was a fall. A 69-year-old man in June 2024. The 67-year-old from the cold open in July 2025. A 72-year-old man on the 12th of June 2026 who the Park Service said succumbed to symptoms of heat-related illness on this trail. Heights are the danger you can see. Heat is the danger that is already happening. And you need to understand what heat actually does, because heat stroke is one of those phrases that sounds like an intensified version of feeling hot, and it is not. It is a different category of event. Exertional heat stroke begins when your body's heat production, plus the heat it is absorbing from the environment, outruns its ability to shed heat. Core temperature climbs past 40 degrees Celsius, 104 Fahrenheit. Above that line, the brain stops working correctly. Confusion, disorientation, loss of balance, but the thermal damage is only the trigger. Current research describes heat stroke as behaving less like overheating and more like sepsis. The heat damages the lining of the gut. Inflammatory molecules flood the bloodstream. The clotting cascade activates in the wrong places. The walls of your blood vessels begin to fail. What follows is multi-organ failure, kidney injury, liver injury, rhabdomyolysis, muscle tissue breaking down and dissolving into the blood, disseminated intravascular coagulation, seizures. Left untreated, the case fatality rate for exertional heat stroke can exceed 50%. Now place that process on this specific trail. Sustained uphill work. Direct sun on an exposed ridge. Rock that has been absorbing solar radiation since dawn and is now radiating it back into you. No shade to duck into. And no water, not to drink, and not to pour over your head. Every one of the body's cooling options requires something the South Kaibab does not have. The strongest number in this entire story is not a death toll. It is a threshold. Park Service researchers spent years logging weather data at Indian Garden, a midpoint station whose conditions closely track the Bright Angel and South Kaibab trails, and comparing it against calls for help. What they found was a physiological cliff edge. Below 95 degrees Fahrenheit, heat-related hiker assists ran at about 6.1 per thousand hiker contacts. At 95 degrees and above, that jumped to 10.4 per thousand, a 71% increase, and statistically about as solid as field data gets. A separately published version of the same team's work reports the jump at 61.5%. Call it somewhere between 60 and 70% either way. 95 degrees is not an extreme forecast in northern Arizona. It is most of the summer, and the canyon amplifies it. Inner canyon shade temperatures can reach 109 degrees. On the exposed sections of the South Kaibab specifically, the Park Service says temperatures can exceed 120. The rim, where you make every decision about your day, runs 20 to 25 degrees cooler than the bottom. The worst version of this on record came in 1996, before the park had a prevention program at all. 65 days above the 95-degree threshold, the most in 25 years. 300 heat-related search and rescue incidents. 482 rescues in total. 5 heat deaths. That single summer is why the park's preventive search and rescue team exists. On the 30th of June, 2013, the high at Phantom Ranch was 113 degrees. That afternoon at about 3:30, a call came in from the emergency phone at the Phantom Ranch Boat Beach. An unconscious hiker, 3/4 of a mile up the South Kaibab Trail. The rangers who reached her were coming from the bottom, not the top, and she is not the person you're picturing. Her name was Sibyl Borger. She was 48 from Fredericksburg, Virginia. Rangers responding from the Phantom Ranch station began CPR when they arrived. It did not work. Her body was flown by helicopter to the South Rim helibase and transferred to the county medical examiner. She was on the first day of a permitted multi-day backcountry trip in a group of 5. Sit with that for a moment because it dismantles the story people want to tell about canyon deaths. She had a permit. She had a plan. She had 4 other people with her. She was not a tourist in flip-flops wandering past a sign. No cause of death was ever publicly released. An autopsy was ordered. No result was announced. So I'm not going to tell you what killed her because nobody told me. What I can tell you is the temperature and the outcome. And here's what almost nobody accounts for about these deaths. Heat and cardiac arrest are frequently the same story with 2 different labels on the death certificate. Cardiac arrest is the single most common cause of death in Grand Canyon National Park, according to the park's own data. Not falls, not drowning, hearts. The mechanism connects directly to the heat. Dehydration reduces your blood volume, so your heart has to beat faster and harder to move less blood. At the same time, your body is dilating the vessels in your skin as hard as it can, trying to dump heat through the surface, which drops your blood pressure further. The result is cardiovascular insufficiency. The heart can no longer deliver enough oxygenated blood to the muscles and organs demanding it. Now add a sustained steep climb at altitude from a rim that sits near 7,000 feet. For a great many people, that is the most demanding cardiac stress test of their entire life, and they are taking it without supervision, without a defibrillator, and without any prior sense of whether they'd pass. The Park Service says it plainly. Pre-existing medical conditions compound the physical stress of summer hiking here. Nobody packs for their own heart, which brings us back to the man from Alvarado, Texas. He turned around at Skeleton Point. He did the thing the rangers spend all summer trying to persuade people to do. He accepted the loss, abandoned the reservation, and started climbing out. He collapsed below Cedar Ridge, 1.5 miles from safety, and the people who found him were other hikers. That's the part I can't get past. Turning back is the right call. It is also sometimes a call you make after the outcome is already fixed, which forces a revision to how we think about falls. The straightforward version is real. A maintained dirt trail on a ridgeline turns an ordinary misstep into a terminal one. Step sideways on a sidewalk and you stumble. Step sideways at ooh-ah point and you fall 400 feet. The Park Service's entire account of that 2016 death is that the woman was hiking and photographing with friends for sunrise and accidentally stepped off the edge of the trail. That's all anyone knows. And I'm not going to embellish it into something more cinematic. That kind of fall is not restricted to summer either. On the 15th of December, 2020, at about 7:40 in the morning, a call came in reporting a fatality above the Black Bridge near the bottom of the trail. Rangers located a 23-year-old man from Phoenix who was believed to be day hiking and who had fallen approximately 80 feet. No cause of the fall was ever established publicly. I have no explanation to give you, and neither does anyone else. But there is a second category, and it's the one that matters here. Heat is a fall multiplier. The Park Service has stated explicitly in a separate Grand Canyon case that heat illness preceded a fall and may have contributed to it, noting that severe heat stroke can produce ataxia, loss of balance, and altered mental status. Read that list again with the ridgeline in mind. Ataxia is the loss of coordinated voluntary movement. Loss of balance is exactly what it sounds like. Altered mental status means the part of you that would notice either of those has already been compromised. Put that person on a 2-foot wide tread with 400 feet of air on one side, and you do not need recklessness. You do not need a selfie. You do not need bad judgment. You need one uncoordinated step. Which means some of what the record files as a fall began, hours earlier, as a decision about water. If you've ever walked past a warning sign at a trailhead because you felt fine at the time, and most of us have, put it in the comments. And if this is making you reconsider a trip you've got planned, drop a like. It genuinely helps this kind of video find the people who need it. Because the part most people get wrong is still ahead. Here's the one that should unsettle you most, because it is the death you can walk into by following instructions correctly. When you sweat heavily, you lose two things: water and sodium. 30 years of trail signage has drilled the first half of that into everyone. Drink water, carry more water, keep drinking. If you replace only the water, your blood sodium concentration falls. And when the sodium outside your cells drops far enough, water moves across the membrane into the cells, including the cells of your brain. That produces cerebral swelling inside a fixed volume of skull. Documented cases show people who drank 4.5 to 6 quarts in 2 to 2.5 hours, presenting with serum sodium as low as 125 millimoles per liter. Now here's the cruel part. The symptoms of hyponatremia are nearly identical to the symptoms of heat exhaustion: nausea, vomiting, confusion, collapse. So when someone goes down on the trail, the instinctive response from them, from their friends, from a well-meaning stranger is to get more water into them. That accelerates it. This is why current Park Service messaging never says water on its own anymore. It pairs water with salty snacks and electrolytes deliberately, and the Parks Prevention Program trains its rangers on hyponatremia alongside heat illness. The Park Service has documented at least one Grand Canyon case requiring rescue in which a person drank an excessive quantity of water and developed an altered level of consciousness. Nobody is afraid of drinking water. That's the whole problem. And it points at something larger about this trail. The failures here aren't dramatic. They're small, reasonable-looking decisions that only reveal themselves later. There's one more mechanism worth naming, mostly because of what it does to the statistics. Sustained hard muscular work in extreme heat causes skeletal muscle cells to break apart and release their contents into the bloodstream, including a protein called myoglobin. Myoglobin is toxic to the kidneys. The result is acute kidney injury, and documented exertional heat stroke cases show rhabdomyolysis with acute renal failure, and in some instances liver failure, severe enough that transplant is considered. None of that necessarily happens on the trail. It happens afterward in an intensive care unit over days. Which means some canyon victims are not canyon deaths in any record. They were rescued, the helicopter came. The story ended with a successful evacuation, and then it kept going somewhere nobody was reporting from. There is no Grand Canyon specific count for this. It isn't a category anyone tracks. So when I tell you 17 people a year, understand that number is the floor of what we can see, not the ceiling of what happens. Now put the mechanisms together and notice that they do not sit side by side. They stack. Heat degrades your coordination, which makes the ridgeline dangerous. Dehydration strains your heart, which makes the climb dangerous. Overdrinking to fix the dehydration swells your brain, which makes your judgment dangerous. And every one of those states produces the same early symptoms: headache, disorientation, fatigue, so you cannot tell from the inside which one is happening to you. This is what I meant by subtraction. The South Kaibab is not trying to kill you. Nothing on this trail is hostile. There is no rockfall zone, no river crossing, no wildlife problem worth mentioning. What the trail does is quietly remove every buffer you would normally have between an ordinary mistake and a fatal one. Bright Angel, the other main corridor route, gives you things: water stations, shade from a side canyon, a ranger station and a campground partway down, somewhere to stop that isn't the top or the bottom. The South Kaibab was built to bypass Bright Angel, and to do that it took the fastest line available, straight down a ridge. Everything it gained in speed and view, it gave up in margin. So when you make a small error here, you leave 40 minutes later than planned, you carry 3 liters instead of 4, you go 1 viewpoint further than you meant to. There is nothing downstream to catch it. On most trails, a small error stays small. On this one, small errors are load-bearing. Nothing on this trail is trying to kill you. It's what isn't here. And that would be manageable if you could reliably notice it happening. You can't. And the reason why is the most interesting part of this whole story. Start with something the National Park Service itself put in writing on its own trail guide about its own trail. The steepness, they say, is very misleading on the way down. The views make it very easy to lose track of how far down you have hiked. They recommend planning for the climb out to take roughly twice as long as the descent. That is a land management agency telling you in an official document that its trail will deceive you about your own position. And it will, because the deception is structural. You are descending. Descending feels efficient, your legs are fresh, the air is cool, and the reward, a bigger view, a closer look at the river, is always slightly further down. On a mountain, the physics protect you. The hard work comes first, so exhaustion turns you around before you're committed. In the canyon, that is inverted. You spend your reserves getting away from safety. Your point of maximum fatigue coincides exactly with your point of maximum distance, maximum heat, and maximum remaining climb. The park used to put it on a sign in 6 words. Down is optional, up is mandatory. Now layer the cognitive damage on top. The Park Service lists headache, disorientation, and confusion as symptoms of heat illness, and warns specifically that they get dismissed as ordinary tiredness, which is the trap in its purest form. The organ that would notice the problem is the organ the problem is damaging. This is why the park's own guidance tells you to watch your companions, not yourself. The search and rescue coordinator has said the key thing to look for in the people around you is whether they seem altered, not whether they say they're okay. They will say they're okay. That's a symptom. And your internal sense of risk is not a reliable backup. A 2025 study of hikers in hot, dry Arizona conditions found that people with higher risk perception reported more heat stress and more thirst, but showed no corresponding difference in their actual physiological measurements. The researchers concluded that risk perception in this setting may track cognitive and perceptual factors more than real physical danger. It's a small study on Phoenix trails rather than in the canyon, so hold it loosely. But the direction is worth knowing. How worried you feel is not a readout of how close you are. Then there is the general psychology of goal fixation and sunk cost, well documented across outdoor pursuits, though not specific to this trail. Turning back feels like discarding the effort you've already spent, and the South Kaibab is engineered accidentally to exploit exactly that. Point. Cedar Ridge, Skeleton Point, the river. A ladder of named goals, each one visible from the last, each one a small negotiation with yourself. But I want to be careful here because the easy version of this section is wrong. The man from Alvarado beat all of it. He got to Skeleton Point, ran the calculation, and turned around. Turning back is the right decision. It is not a guarantee. And that distinction is the difference between advice and honesty, which raises the question everyone assumes has a comforting answer. What happens when it goes wrong? Less than you think and slower than you think. Every constraint that makes this trail dangerous for you makes it dangerous for the people coming to get you. There is no water on the route, so rescuers carry everything in and cannot resupply. There is no shade, so both the patient and the rescue team are fully exposed for the entire operation. Cedar Ridge, a mile and a half down, has pit toilets and no emergency phone. The Park Service states it directly in its own advisories. The canyon is expansive, reaching visitors who need care can take time, and you should be prepared to self-rescue. Read that phrase again. A federal agency is telling you in advance that the plan is you. There's a first-hand account of what response used to look like here, published by the Park Service itself. A retired search and rescue branch chief described the pre-prevention era. Vague reports coming in, no way to know whether a call meant cardiac arrest or somebody resting in the shade, no option to delay, rangers running down the trail in the worst heat of the year. One call, he said, was enough to spend a responder for the rest of the day. And the outcomes are sobering even now. In June 2026, across 3 heat-related inter-canyon deaths in 5 days, one of them on the South Kaibab, the Park Service reported that despite rapid response and aerial support, all 3 people were already deceased when responders arrived. In the 2025 South Kaibab death, medical personnel came down on foot, and bystanders had already started CPR before they got there. Here's the part almost nobody knows. There is no legal duty to rescue you. In 1992, in Johnson versus the United States Department of the Interior, the 10th Circuit ruled that search and rescue is a discretionary function of government. No statute imposes an obligation. Whether, when, and how to respond is left to the judgment of the search and rescue team in the field. They will come. They almost always come. Roughly 60 to 70 trained volunteers back up 7 seasonal rangers and 1 full-time supervisor, and as of 2024, that system was reported to be short-staffed. But they come as a matter of practice, not as a matter of your right. So who is this actually happening to? The Park Service identifies the most susceptible groups as children under 8, adults over 65, and people with pre-existing medical conditions. It also notes that the elevation makes the canyon challenging even for experienced hikers. In the South Kaibab cases, the park has publicly reported in recent years, the heat and exertion deaths have skewed older, 72, 69, 67, 48, while the falls skewed younger, 35 and 23. That's a handful of cases, not a data set, so don't build a theory on it. But it's the shape of what's on the record. Park-wide, the pattern is more useful. In 2014, the majority of Grand Canyon search and rescue callouts involved men over 50. And the leading reason for those callouts was not injury and was not getting lost. It was fatigue, hiker inexperience, and physical inability. People simply running out of themselves in a place where that is enough. Now here is the number that should land hardest, and it isn't a death statistic at all. In the 2015 season, prevention rangers made contact with 117,267 hikers on the corridor trails. Of those, 28,478, 24%, required corrective safety advice, inadequate water or food, wrong gear, no plan, hiking beyond their ability, 1 in 4. That is not a fringe of reckless outliers. That is a quarter of everyone walking down the trail on an ordinary Tuesday, doing something a trained ranger thought would hurt them. And this is precisely why the South Kaibab gets the attention it does. Between 2011 and 2015, prevention rangers logged 8,225 patrol hours on Bright Angel and 5,274 on the South Kaibab, far more than North Kaibab or Hermit. The second most heavily patrolled trail in the park, despite being shorter and less trafficked than the first. They are not there for the view. And the deaths themselves aren't happening deep in the wilderness. Below Cedar Ridge, 1.5 miles in. At Ooh-Ah Point, 1 mile in. 3/4 of a mile above Phantom Ranch. Above the Black Bridge, one of the deadliest stretches of this trail is the first 1.5 miles. You are never far from the trailhead here. You are only far from being able to reach it. The most effective safety measure ever applied to the South Kaibab Trail was not a railing or a sign or a fence. The park closed the parking lot. Before the trailhead was shut to private vehicles, a longtime backcountry ranger described what happened. People would drive out, walk to the edge, look down, and get, in his words, sucked right in. Once you had to take a shuttle bus, once getting there required a deliberate act, distress calls on the South Kaibab dropped significantly. That is the whole thing in one administrative decision. Nothing on that trail is trying to kill you. It's what isn't here. The canyon isn't malicious, it's just consistent. It keeps operating exactly as it has for millions of years, indifferent to who walks into it, and for somewhere around a dozen or more people a year, that indifference is the last thing they meet. The South Kaibab is one of the great walks on this continent, and it is dangerous for the same reasons it's beautiful. The fact that stays with me is the man who turned around. He made the right call, and it wasn't enough. And that's the honest version, not the comfortable one. Which mechanism surprised you most, and where should I take this next? Subscribe if you want the real reasons these places kill.